Happy holidays, everybody. That's right, my name is Drybear, and welcome back to another patch analysis video. And the reason this is a little bit late, and what I've been doing for the last few patches and the PTSs as well, is I do a patch overview kind of promptly after the changes come out. However, for this one, this was so big, and this went into live, and this changed everything. Not only that, but there were some server stability issues and all that kind of crazy stuff, and there's still some problems going on. But I wanted to play through the patch, and I wanted to talk to people and see how they felt about it, get some ideas about it, and then try it before I judged it. So that's what this video is going to be about, is going into the changes, and then at the end of the video I'll probably go into a section where if these changes have to stay the way they are, what can we do to fix them, what can we do to make them better, what would have to go along with it, and all that kind of stuff. But as far as that goes, I'm probably going to put on some footage now, because I know you guys have ADD and you get distracted looking at my face. So I'll put on some footage of Xbalanque and be able to watch that, and I'll go through the analysis as well and all that kind of stuff. And what do you think, buddy? Do you like stats? He doesn't like stats. He doesn't like stats. To start things off, let's do a brief overview of what has changed in the most recent patch so we're all up to date on what I'm talking about here. First off, Xbalanque got introduced to the game. He's a ranged physical carry. He seems to be okay. There's nothing too insanely broken about him, and there's nothing too insanely bad about him either. And I think over the next few days and possibly the next week or so, everyone's going to figure out how to utilize him better. I mean, even the last few days, people started out maxing out his branching bolas. Now they're maxing out his rising jaguar because it does a lot of damage and scales quickly if they have the poison on him. So people are going like early game penetration to try and get extra damage out of that. It does have a trade-off with it, but there's a lot of changes, and it's getting to the point now where people aren't even maxing out his one even second or third anymore. They're kind of leaving it till the end. They also introduced a game mode of the day. There's a lot of cool ones involved with that. You can check that out. I'll probably put some of those up as well. There's some holiday skins. They also introduced focus, which I'm gonna put this off. I'm gonna talk about focus in a bit once I do the overview. So they added stats. These aren't something that is completely far and removed. It's something that's on the side. You can pick up stats if you'd like, and I'll talk about that as well. There's a lot of item changes. They changed the stats around the items. They shaved the edges off of the conquest map. They moved around some of the buffs. They put in minion camps in the jungle that don't have buffs themselves. They're just there for experience and gold. They added silhouettes on the map, kind of like if you guys have played Left 4 Dead or Left 4 Dead 2, where you can see your allies through the walls. There's a silhouette through the walls that you can see. They added a new joust map. There's domination fixes. They put towers into the domination spawns. You can't spawn camp anybody. They improved the god screen. They added they removed the passive from active items and reduced the cost of them down to 250 gold. They increased the jungle cap experience back up again to what it was originally. They nerfed Bacchus's chug so that it no longer gives physical power. Cupid is back to being physical. Freya's irradiate and pulse give physical lifesteal. Hell now has her ulti at level 1, and this starts at level 0, so it doesn't offset any of her scaling. And then Thor's stun is still a stun, however it no longer does damage. Now, I'd like to begin the discussion by talking about stats, because it's the kind of the thing that everyone has been worrying about. It's the thing that's been looming over our heads, and it's kind of the thing that actually a lot of players have been dropping because of the game is changing too much. The simplicity is gone, and even now how the stats are implemented as is, it's still challenging, and there's a lot of things that need to be going into that. So to begin with, stats overall are difficult because it overcomplicates the game. I mean, me personally, coming from games like Elder Scrolls, I played probably 500 hours of Morrowind, probably like 800 of Oblivion. I played probably like 300 of Skyrim, and Fallout New Vegas, I think I have like 1,000 hours, and I play a lot of RPGs and those kind of things, and those little games where you're kind of min-maxing stats and developing your character in that manner, and something that I enjoy a lot. So I do enjoy the idea of stats, but I don't think it belongs in the setting of SMITE or MOBAs in general. I think it's a little bit challenging to implement that, and the way it is now is rough, because since the stats are available at all times, it allows people to kind of pick and choose and build their own items, and especially what's prevalent now is starting items in general. People are abusing the fact that they can buy a bunch of health as a tank. They can buy a bunch of MP5 as literally anybody. I mean, there are Xbalanques who are buying massive amounts of mana, and they never have to deactivate their branching bolas, or people that are going to the mid lane, they're just buying lots of MP5. This makes it challenging because it's very difficult to prevent that kind of abuse. I mentioned in the intro that I would go over possible solutions or ways that if it is not an option to remove or roll back any of the changes. What would need to come along with the changes that are in the game now to make it a little bit more bearable, or something that would make it successful. And if we're talking about the stats, there's a couple options that I've heard in the community. People come up with really good ideas or things that would kind of limit the damage that's going on right now. The first off is just repricing. I mean, to make the stats a little bit more accurate to what they're providing, and this is something that's going to take a long time. You can't just price the stats specifically right off the bat, and as you can tell, I mean, literally right away, I mean, I showed a stat price comparison versus buying an item tier system or buying the item with stats plus the special item to get the same effectiveness, same exact stats, and I'll throw that up on the screen right about now. And as you can see, that the items become much more expensive by buying the stats individually and then buying the special item. This was done one PTS ago before they implemented the changes to live, where they had the special items still around. And you can go to the video that I have, the last PTS video that I have, to check that out. But as you can see, it's very inefficient to spend money on stats to get items. However, there is some individual mixing you can do by buying individual stats, and it's difficult to price these because they thought of some decent pricing for all of these, and they all seemed relatively okay. I mean, there wasn't really anything bad about the pricing, and the pricing was accurate to how valuable the stats were. But even then, I mean, you can see now it's 300 gold to buy 10 MP5, then 334, 20, and then it keeps going up like that. However, in the beginning, that much MP5 is so valuable. I mean, it's so easy to abuse that and keep your abilities running constantly and your mana up all the time. I mean, the regen gets ridiculously high if you abuse a little bit of sprinkling of stats here and there. Tanks are buying lots of protections because they're really cheap, and also a lot of health too. So there's this kind of abuse system because the stats are not equivalent to what they are. I mean, some of the stats are more valuable than others, but they're not priced in that way. Another option is to make it so that you can't buy stats until you're level 20. That way, the idea of stats being kind of like a replacement for items when you have a full inventory. It's a pretty decent idea that kind of keeps the game going into late game, even though, you know, you finish your items and you feel like you're not really improving or becoming stronger. You're just waiting for a big push or a fire giant kill or to take out the Minotaur or get a Phoenix push or something like that. You can still be spending that money on stats rather than buying elixirs and potions. So there's kind of like this second aspect to it, which is nice. So maybe limiting the purchasing of stats to level 20, making that a requirement. That will force the stat buying to be late game, and then that will prevent all abuse in the early game or even the early mid game, where people are just buying specific stats they need in small amounts, which makes them very strong. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is focus, and this is a double-edged sword. There's a good reason for it to come about, but the current implementation is something that's lacking. So what focus does, and the reason why I like the idea of it, is that it addresses the problem where utility type characters can go for full damage or for kill typed builds and be dual faceted at the same time. Characters like Hell, where they can go for full damage, but they also have the utility aspect of their light stance where they can heal and remove debuffs and crowd control effects. Characters like Ra, who can go tanky and go for damage as well. They also have a heal that comes out of it plus the slow, and they're very difficult to kill. There's like this multi-headed aspect to it where characters who can dish out great amounts of damage have this huge backing of utility and defense on the other end. And I think the idea of focus is to make sure that those two are separate. That if you are deciding to go for damage, then you're focusing mainly on damage, pun intended. And if you're going to help your team and go for a utility type role, then you have to focus on that. The problems that are going on with this is that it weakens a lot of the characters who have a heavy reliance on their abilities in the early game. Good examples of this are characters like Artemis, who the trap really doesn't do very much without much focus. And this is pretty much affects all the characters. The way it is now, a lot of the abilities that you rely on early game don't really have that much strength going on. If you look at characters like Bakasura, who has a heavy reliance on Eat Minion early game, if you have played Bakasura since the release of the patch, his Eat Minion really doesn't do anything in the early game. Now, if you get some items, there are a lot of items that have focus on them that you can pick up, which will also get you further towards your goal of whatever you're building. I mean, if you're a physical carry, you can go for a Soul Eater, you can go for an Eye of Retaliation. Transcendence also has some focus on it. It allows you to use more mana. And there's also a couple other items that do have focus on them. However, if you look at characters that have a good reliance on abilities for their laning phase, Bakasura is a good one, because without any focus at level 1 or the early level laning phases like levels 1 through 6 or so, where you have no focus at all, Eat Minion really doesn't heal you for very much at all. I think at level 1 it heals you for 35 plus nothing, so at 35 HP, that's not even worth the mana that you spent on it. That's like 2.5–3% of your maximum HP depending on what you buy and how you level, but it's just, it turns that ability into something that's not useful at all, where a character like Bakasura would rely heavily on Eat Minion, simply because he's a melee character, and if he is going to go in and fight a lot, he's going to take some damage in that travel time heading into the battle to fight, as a lot of melee characters do. So when you add in that focus and you scale down those abilities drastically, you're now removing Bakasura's ability to lane effectively, simply because he can't rely on that ability anymore. So what this brings me to is the next part where I say, if this is going to stay in the game and this stay how it is, what can we do to make it better? And the reality that you have to look at it is, it's a process. It's one of those things where you have to just go through it. Implementing focus all at once was a daunting task. If I were to be involved in the process of implementing a focus type ability or stat right off the bat and trying to put it in all at once, even though they only had like 26, 25 characters, whatever, at the time, it's just very, very challenging, because you have to scale down the starting values of those utility abilities to a point where they're still useful, but they're not as useful, and they have a reliance on getting more focus. However, they also have to scale up enough where if you focused on focus, then you could just maximize the effectiveness of that and justify the purchase of that focus stat. So I think if they're going to keep it the way it is, they're going to have to look at each individual god and make sure that the starting values for each of those utility abilities, the passives, and all the abilities that have utility aspects to them have good starting values. I don't think there's a couple characters, I think there's like 5 or 6 of them that I went through and played, and I was just appalled with how useless the abilities became without any focus at all. I mean, like On Her's Slow, Bakasura's Eat Minion, Artemis's Trap. Some of these are very useless. Granted, they have the ability to buy focus, and also they have these kind of characters have a different role other than utility. They do rely heavily on these. There's some stuns which can be understood, but there are some characters that do have a good reliance on their utility ability just to make it through the laning phase, and limiting them in that aspect kind of kills their early game, which could kill their mid game and late game as well. So all in all, I think that stats don't really have a place in this game. I think I like I enjoy stats myself, but I don't think there's a comfortable place for it. It can scare away new players, and definitely scare away the casual players that don't really have a deep involvement in the competitive scene, or the idea of SMITE as well, the meta and all that kind of stuff. But if they're going to keep stats, there's definitely some adjustments they have to make. They have to make sure that the scaling and the pricing is a little bit more accurate, and this is something that comes in time. This is not something that I expect to happen right away, and if they do, they don't adjust it that perfectly, and I don't think it can be adjusted perfectly, but if they do, if they can't get it there, then they definitely need to make it sure that they limit the levels that you can buy it and the amounts you can buy it possibly. I think forcing it towards late game is a good idea. Maybe after level 15 you can begin purchasing stats, or maybe even limit it until like level 20 when people have their items completed, or at least like level 10 or something. Just make sure that they can include stats into their starting builds, because it's really hard to balance that, and I think if they focus a lot on balancing the stats for level 1 purchasing, then it's going to ruin the idea of stats overall, because I think the prices are pretty close to what they should be. They're pricey, they're expensive to go after stats, but the bonus that you get in the early game per price is actually quite effective just for like level 1. When you go your first trip out of the well and you're purchasing stats for the first time, it's very effective, and it's difficult to balance both sides of that. And I think if they try to focus on balancing the pricing, then it'll ruin it. So I think if they just put a level requirement on the stats, it could work out quite nicely in their favor. And as far as focus goes, I think that it is a good idea. but possibly a different implementation, or maybe a lot of adjustments and brainstorming and forethought going into the current implementation for focus, because I personally don't like the way it's implemented now. I think it could work with a lot of ideas and looking into the specifics of every god and the scaling and the starting values of all the utility abilities, but I think it does make a challenge for the creation of new gods as well. If you look forward into the future, every time you make a god, you have to make sure that the scaling and the starting values of all the utility abilities, including passives, ultimates, everything, stuns, slows, all that kind of stuff has to be taken into account in a big pile with all the other stuff you have to focus on when you're creating a new character, making sure that they're balanced in all types of ways, early game, mid-early game, late game, mid game, like all the different, and then team fights and all that kind of stuff. There's so many aspects to creating a new character and making sure it's balanced, because you have to kind of limit your own creative thought and also make sure it's realistic and down to earth and try to put all that together. And then I think throwing in focus balancing and scaling for utility abilities just makes it so much more challenging, and I think it's going to put a big strain on making new gods and getting them out on time if you try to stick with this current implementation. But I do like the idea, and I love it. I think it does balance out a lot of characters that can get out of hand if they're not kept in check. And that's about all that I wanted to talk about for this patch. I think a lot of the changes were pretty expected. There's nothing surprising about the rest of the changes. The shaving off of the conquest map was a little different, and I think it does inflect, or I've talked about this in a couple of my videos, it does direct a lot of the action inward, and I think keeping the action away from the edges of the map kind of involves the other lanes and makes it more dynamic. Possibly maybe making it a little bit bigger or adjusting it a little bit. I liked how they made the side lanes a little bit more jagged, so there's more places to hide, to be physically not seen, and it makes ganks more dynamic and involved. And I do actually like the new layout. I love the silhouettes. I love the silhouettes. I think that when you take a bird's eye view game and you force it to be third person, there's a lot of visual aspects that take away from that. When you're playing other MOBA games like League of Legends, Heroes of New Earth, Dota, all the other ones, it's a lot less difficult to lose track as compared to SMITE. I mean, SMITE, you can easily lose track of your teammates, team fights, all that kind of stuff, just because you can't see that overview of the whole map, and you can't look away from your character to go look at a different lane or anything like that. So I think the silhouettes is actually necessary. I as much as I like it and love it, I think it was necessary, and it does make the game a little bit more team play oriented and helps players who are queuing with people they don't know to be more involved in a team fight. So that's going to be it, guys, for the Xbalanque patch analysis video. Happy holidays to everyone who's tuning in. I'm posting this up on Christmas Day. I hope you are all enjoying your family outings and big events and food and pies and all that kind of stuff. As always, my name is Drybear. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate all your views, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video.